So I decided to change this up. You guys have seen people sit behind the podium or sit here all day. I'm going to stand down here and move and keep this interesting and see if the camera operator can follow me the whole time. I decided you needed to be woken up too. So, okay, we got the slideshow up. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the issues going on in 2019. I'm going to talk about national issues, and Sarah's going to talk about some of the state issues. So looking at it from a national perspective, a lot of the stuff we're looking at are involving animal agriculture in some way, pesticide usage in some way, bankruptcy in some way, environmental issues which could fit in animal agriculture and could fit in pesticides in some way. And these have kind of been the driving issues in ag law in certain areas for this year, past years, and I'm pretty sure that I'm not a very good crystal ball person. I had a good reaction yesterday when I actually got something right and sent stuff in ahead of time before they needed it. That's pretty rare in my world that I'm actually that good at forecasting. But my guess is most of these will stay the issues we have to pay attention to in 2020. We're not going to talk about the hemp regulations today. Kevin's somewhere in the back of the room. If he wants to talk, oh, two Kevins are in the back of the room. If they want to talk about this issue, feel free to talk to them. This would take way too much time for me to talk about today. So let's talk about bankruptcy. I'm going to put some tables up here in a second to show what bankruptcies have done in the past well, not really the calendar year. Looking at September 30th, 2019, through the same period last year. Chapter 12 filings are up 24% nationally. This means 24% more people have filed bankruptcy with the agricultural title of the bankruptcy code than in past years. Why is that a big deal? Well, it could mean we have more farms failing. The other issue is this is just Chapter 12. It's not the other titles in the bankruptcy code. So other titles may be picking up farm bankruptcies that don't qualify for ag bankruptcies specifically. And this is an increase after we saw them decrease in 2018. So move on. So what does this mean for the state of Maryland? If this is working right, I can zoom in. We have 7 more filings in the state for this year. If we look at the other areas, Pennsylvania's up 21, Virginia's up 6 from the previous year, looking at the same. And I have to give Farm Bureau credit. They have really great maps that are really easy to steal as pictures off their website and work really well. If we look at it for the Mid-Atlantic region, if I can move this over, we're up 17% for the Mid-Atlantic region. I wanted to use this because the maps were so small, it makes it easier. The only spot where we're not really up high, well, I went forward, is in the Northeast. If we look and we move to the West, we're up 74% in the Northwest. The West, 65% in filings. So there may be an issue going on. What's some of the issues that Congress has looked at to fix the Family Farmer Relief Act? Was recently signed into law by the president. It increases the aggregated debt limit under Chapter 12 from 4.1 million to 10 million. So this may actually increase this number. We don't know at this point. This is pretty new. So this may actually end up having more people qualify for Chapter 12 bankruptcy, so we may actually see this increase. I started off depressing. We're going to get more energetic as we go along. But this is an area to where we probably need to pay attention as to, are more Chapter 12s being filed? And is this causing problems even with some of the trade relief and other programs Congress and the administration have put out to help farmers through some of these difficult times? So what does this mean? We should really watch to see if this leads to more Chapter 12 bankruptcies in 2020 or through the rest of the year since the law just went into effect. And I should point out that 10 million is pegged to inflation, so it will go up each year. How many people know what WOTUS stands for? There's a theme to this one. The other one there wasn't much of a theme to. This one there's a theme in the gifts. See if you can pick up on the theme. The previous administration defined waters of the U.S. in 2015. The idea was to provide clarity into it. This was an area within the law Congress had never defined. So no administration had really defined it up until that point. There had been issues with the way the Supreme Court had ruled on how waters of the U.S. would work, and that had created some not real clarity in the law in some of the rulings. If this comes up. The ruling was immediately challenged in federal court, And it was implemented in some states, and it wasn't implemented in some states. So we fast forward to the Trump administration. The Trump administration has recently announced, within the past few months, that that rule has been repealed. This is part of a two-step process that they had put together. The idea was first we repeal the old rule, and then we put a new rule into place. We don't know what that new rule is going to look like at this point. We're not entirely clear. So it's not really clear what that new rule is going to look like. The president has said he wants it based off Justice Scalia's opinion in the Rapanos decision. How many people have heard of Rapanos besides Gary? So it was a 4-1-4 decision where at one times we look at what the majority said, sometimes we look at the dissent said. There's a legal terminology for that. I can't use it while I'm up on stage. So if we look at that, he wanted it based off Scalia's opinion. What's happened to the Supreme Court since then? Is Justice Scalia going to go through the door at any point? It would be pretty hard. Justice Kennedy still there, the one that was the one in the 4-1-4 decision? He's gone too. They've been replaced with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. Do we know how they're going to rule on a WOTUS case yet? Remember I said I don't do crystal balls? I don't do crystal balls on this. This is pretty hard to figure out. So we don't even know if what the president wants still has Supreme Court backing on it. So this is an area where we don't actually know if the Supreme Court would uphold the rule if it came to. So what should we look forward to in 2020 if the new rule comes out? That's the end, right? There'll be no lawsuits, right, guys? No one's going to sue at any point, right? So once it's announced, I'm pretty sure, and goes into effect, there'll be lawsuits, and more lawsuits at least filed in every federal district court in some way challenging it. And what happens in next year in 2020? We have an election, right? What happens in 2021 if we have a new administration? Is it going to be the rule that's announced this year? Nobody knows. I hope your crystal ball is better than mine. The other Clean Water Act case to pay attention to is the Supreme Court. I say will hear. I gave this presentation in September and forgot to update the slide. They did hear it last week, a case involving Maui County where there was a discharge into a groundwater source that eventually hits a waters of the U.S. Should this be covered by the Clean Water Act? That's not entirely clear, and the Supreme Court is going to rule on this. The trial court in the Ninth Circuit said, yes, it is covered. The Supreme Court, stay tuned, next year, come back. We'll talk about it again because probably in June they'll make the decision. It's encouraging you to come back, right? Climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. How many people involved in any bit of animal agriculture have heard about a recent case out of the Minnesota Court of Appeals that didn't really deny a permit, said the agency had to go back and restart the process because of greenhouse gas emissions were not taken into account? Yeah, so a few people have this. I got a number of emails about it. So the Minnesota Court of Appeals basically ruled that basically the state agency had to take this into account. We're going to talk about why here on the next slides. So Minnesota has this law similar to the National Environmental Protection Act. How many people have heard about the National Environmental Protection Act? So the National Environmental Protection Act actually does not regulate you in the audience in any way. It basically says that the federal government is going to make an action, they have to take into account the environmental benefits or the environmental impact of that action. They have to start out by doing an environmental assessment. If the environmental assessment comes back too high, that it's going to have a huge environmental impacts, they need to do an environmental impact statement. They may still be able to do the project even if the environmental impact statement comes back saying too high on the environmental impacts, as long as there's mediation put in that can lower the environmental impacts. Gary's shaking his head, so I actually got NEPA right. Minnesota has an exact same law like that, state law that says any government action has to have a state environmental assessment done before it did it. So what happened? State agency goes in and they do an environmental assessment. They send it out for public comment like they're supposed to. There is no spot in the worksheet for taking into account climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. I won't pick on Gary. Is not doing your homework ever a good answer to a question at any point in your life? That's what happened here. The court basically looks at this and goes, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. The state agency never dealt with any of these issues once they were raised by that. They just kind of bypass it, says, not on our worksheet, we actually can't look at this, we don't know what to do. The Court of Appeals agreed with the environmental groups. They basically said, yeah, you have to deal with them in some way. Somebody raised them, you have to deal with them. They're now there. You have to determine if you need to do an environmental impact statement before you just move on. We don't care if your worksheet doesn't include this. The worksheet isn't the law. The worksheet's just the worksheet you work off of, so figure out how to do this. So they point out the fact that we don't actually, in some cases, know how to measure these is not actually a legitimate excuse. You actually do have to deal with these in some way. So the court reversed the decision, denying the need for the environmental impact statement and the decision to grant the water discharge permit, so they needed to go back and redo it. So let's flip on to animal ag issues. They're continuing to be a hot button. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip that because apparently I have 5 minutes left. Skip that. California confinement issues. They're going to be a problem potentially for people down the road meeting these. In 2020 and 2022, they were voted into place in 2018. I'm sure there's a challenge to that right to farm. We still have ongoing appeals next year in the North Carolina hog farm litigation. That should take place the first of the year. Maryland's challenge, which isn't really a right to farm, to the CAFO permit under NEPA is still ongoing, last I looked. Hemsel, one of the few cases, and then I'll probably end with right to farm and hand it over to Sarah, and you have my notes for the rest of this so you guys can learn all about the other fun issues. Hemsel is this case out of Indiana with a right to farm decision. It's Hemsel versus Hemsel. It's not a bad divorce case. It's distant cousins suing distant cousins. The idea is the Indiana Court of Appeals ruled that this farm did have the right to start a hog farm on its operation. The court had to look at when the farm was established. Would it have been a nuisance? They go back to 1941 when the farm was established. It was not, wouldn't have been a nuisance in 1941. In fact, it really probably wouldn't have been a nuisance today because the area was zoned for agriculture and it was zoned for intensive agriculture. And the other problem with the case was Mr. Hemsel, the person suing his cousin, actually had a hog farm at one point within the past 5 years. So there were some concerns that he might just be in a bad mood now with his cousin. The other problem that the court points out, and this is the reason why I want to talk about this case mainly, is the court points out is at no point did anybody ever challenge the permits when it was going forward. They waited until the farm had opened and then made the decision to challenge it. Gary, when's the best time to make changes to the CAFO? Is it when it's in the permitting process or after it's established? The court said you should have challenged it because you didn't do anything here. We're not going to let this continue. So this was a right to farm victory. The final right to farm deal is going international with right to farm. Australia is looking at introducing a right to farm law in New South Wales. It looks exactly like American right to farm laws. The biggest change is they're increasing trespass penalties for people coming on farms. So if you have a biosecurity plan on your farm, it goes from not only this lower penalty, what used to be $5,000, that doesn't work the way I want it to. It's kind of slow. $5,000 up to $13,000 and $22,000, depending on how many people are involved in it. The goal is, and the reason I have this up here is, the opposition and all of this has been to trespass. The Parliament has made it clear it is very open to stopping animal activists from coming on the farms. And it has been pointed out this is an American-style ag gag law. This is not an American-style ag gag law. It is just a changes to trespass laws. Ag gag laws do something totally different in the U.S. And I'm going to stop there, skip pesticide, and hand it over to Sarah. And it should get to Sarah's eventually.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I'll try to go quickly, so if you have any questions about the subjects that we had to skip through, you'll have time to ask. I wanted to go through just a few sort of very specific state law changes that happened in the last session. Senate Bill 546, I don't know if you paid attention to it last session, but this just went into effect last month. And it enacted some changes in nutrient management and the manure transport program and having to do with confined animal feeding operations. So I'm going to go through those quickly. So nutrient management update. So farmers with late or missing annual implementation reports, or AIRs, and I will try not to get too deep into the acronym soup, but this is an acronym heavy couple slides here, may be fined after notice of violation up to $1,000. And there's also going to be a fine for failing to implement a nutrient management plan that's capped at $500 per violation and up to $5,000 per operator per year. So some changes in the fining scheme there. Good to know if you're representing farmers who are going to be running afoul of this. Phosphorus management tool, PMT updates. So anyone who applies phosphorus to land that's in violation of the PMT may now be fined $250. And folks that write nutrient management plans, they have to also comply with PMT implementation deadlines and submission of soil test data, and failure to do so may result in a fine of $250. In terms of the AIR, there's now going to be an expanded section on manure transport, so you're going to have to specify the amount of animal manure imported to and exported from the farm. So there will be an effort to keep the data confidential to the greatest extent possible, but for imported animal manure, the name and location of the sending farm. For exported animal manure, the name and location of the farm or the alternative use facility or broker who received the manure. And then if the farm operator receives animal manure through a manure broker, the broker has to provide the operator with the name and location of the sending farm. So pretty good that we got to this point in an Ag and Environmental Law Conference without talking about manure, but you knew we couldn't get all the way to lunch without talking about it. CAFO updates. So there are some new fines and penalties, I shouldn't say that, fees is the best way to say it. So before construction of a CAFO must be covered by the general discharge permit. So you can't, before you can start construction on that CAFO, you gotta make sure you're covered by that general discharge permit. There's going to be a one-time fee. That number's actually incorrect. The one-time fee is going to be $2,000 for coverage under the general discharge permit if you're at a house capacity of 350,000 square feet. So these are for very large CAFOs. You're going to have to pay that at the outset for a proposal, or if you're doing a modification to upgrade a CAFO up to that 350,000 square feet. And then those CAFOs are going to be subject to an annual fee, and I apologize, that number is also incorrect. It's going to be $1,200 for continual coverage. So now we're ready for questions.
Do we have any questions?
Questions?
We covered it so well.
They're ready for lunch.
Yeah.
Do you want to go back to pesticides?
Yeah, we can go back to pesticides real quick. Let's see if I can back this up. All I know is I saw the 5 minutes and I actually paid attention this time. So we can talk about pesticide issues. So how many people have seen these ads? How many people have seen these ads on TV and wish they would stop? They're like most mass litigations. I wish all of them would stop at times, but this is the Roundup litigation. It's based on a product's liability theory. In this, juries in California have awarded, and I think I missed a few of these. I just tried to do a good news review to see if I could catch them all. But the ones I found were $81 million, $300 million, and $2 billion. That was later reduced to $86.7 million. Bayer now has all this money just lying around, right, guys? It's just a big pot of money. The argument is basically that with Roundup, they're using it, it's basically defective, and because of its defectiveness, it's causing cancer in individuals. Currently, there are over 11,000 cases filed within the US waiting for either to go to trial or in mediation. I believe almost all of them are in mediation currently. I know there were a couple trials that were supposed to start within the past month that have been delayed because of ongoing mediation. But people shouldn't ignore this. How many people paid attention maybe within the past month? There were news reports that Bayer was going to pull Roundup off the market. They were going to stop making Roundup altogether. That was a rumor going around at one point, and it was based off these litigations. So it's something people should pay attention to, that potentially it could cause impacts down the road. The only problem I have is how many people actually apply Roundup as that individual is in that. Would you like me to go back to the other photos and see if you actually apply Roundup that way as well? In some cases, they don't. How many people remember the dicamba issues from a few years ago that in some cases are still ongoing in some states? The first case will go to trial in 2020, January 27, 2020 in the Eastern District, I believe it's the Eastern District, Western District of Missouri, I believe. This is the one involving Missouri peach farmer Bader Farms. How many people know anything about class action litigation besides some of the attorneys in the room? So with class action, usually the first case is the first two are bellwethers. They're usually the first set, a pool of plaintiffs is good for the plaintiffs class. The first pool in the second group is good for the defendants, and we try to figure out what the cases will be worth based off that to figure out settlement. This is not a bellwether case. This just has so weird facts and was filed first. It's going to trial first. So it will probably not set any of the precedent for the other trials. So yeah, that was the main stuff.
I was going to add, one place where we try to keep folks up to date throughout the year on developing topics is through our posts on the Maryland Risk Management Education blog. And so on the slideshow that'll be flipping during lunch, you'll see the web link to that. And so if you haven't yet subscribed, I recommend you subscribe to the Maryland Risk Management Education blog. We update it a couple times a week, and we try to hit all these hot topics and keep people up to date as things change.
Colby's got a question.
You kind of talked about the North Carolina hog lawsuit that's going on with Smithfield, and doing some research on that down in North Carolina. The thing that I thought was very interesting is that the lawyers that were pushing that suit targeted the African American community around those hog farms, and specifically told them that they would not be suing the hog farmers, that they were suing Smithfield, which was in Virginia, and that they wouldn't be targeting the hog farmers. And then what happened is Smithfield consequently shut down those hog farms because of the issues. Well, then when a lot of these were friends with the hog farmers, had been neighbors for 40, 50 years. That was the only way they were able to be qualified, because they'd been there prior to the hog farm starting. And when they went to say, hey, we didn't want you to shut down our neighbor, you said this was to target them. And when they said, we don't want to be a part of this, they said, too bad. You're in, and if you want out, then you have to pay all the legal fees to get out. And so basically what's happening is they're targeting these distressed areas or minority communities, getting them lumped into these class action lawsuits and going. And I guess my question is back to you guys, is on the right to farm law that we have in Maryland compared to North Carolina, do you see something like this happening on the poultry industry, or are we covered?
Again, my crystal ball sucks, remember that. I would say we're better protected. There was an issue in North Carolina's law that's been changed that basically said if somebody was there before and it would have been a nuisance then, we had to look at that period. Maryland doesn't have that, so that would limit a lot of the North Carolina-like issues. Now, if we're looking at Delaware and other states around here, they have those problems, we don't. The other thing that probably helps, and North Carolina had this too, although because the right to farm law didn't apply, they didn't have to go through mediation. You are sort of forced first to kind of go through this mediation process that we're going to talk about later in the afternoon on that. And then some of the punitive damages laws that were really benefiting in North Carolina aren't here. So we can't get it's harder to get punitive damages from what I can tell in this state than it is in North Carolina. Wow, we did just such a good job.
We did.
Answering everything. Nobody has
Do
questions.
you have any other questions?
I would say one thing on Colby's question too. The other thing that went on was not only that you're suing a company in Virginia, but after they were bought out by the Chinese company, it became, now you're suing a company in China from what I hear. And that really encouraged people to join in the lawsuits as well.
All right, going. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.